Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our daily Lunch and Learn. My name is Derek Hippa. I am a solution architect here at Decisions. Today is Thursday. It is 12:01 p.m. So I'll be happy to answer any questions today. I think we had a couple pre-questions prior to the meeting. But if anyone has any questions, more than welcome to post them in the chat. We could get you off mute if you wanted to talk through a scenario, kind of go over anything that you guys might be facing. If not, I can kind of jump right into some of these other questions that we've had. All right, so one of the pre-questions that we got was saying that I have an external truth table in my flow with more than 1,000 records. The data source is a database structure and decisions. My flow uses this truth table with a for each step. It has taken almost 20 seconds to debug the whole flow. It takes more time whenever it needs to go through the truth table. How can I improve flow execution runtime? In addition, I have a page with CRUD actions with the same data as the external truth table, and it takes a few seconds to load. Is it possible to improve this time too? So with a truth table, especially an external truth table, you have the ability to import the data right into the truth table in which you could use. Truth tables are really handy in certain circumstances. It pretty much combines many rules into one. Instead of having a flow with many rules all separated that do certain logic, depending on if it's true or false, you can combine that logic into a truth table. So they're very useful. But once you start having truth tables that have many records in it, even say over 100 records or so, they can be very problematic with performance. So it really depends on the use case. So what I mean by that is I'll actually open up my flow designer so we can kind of actually look at what a truth table looks like. All right. So with the truth table, and you have many records in it, if you don't need all of those records, if you are able to execute it on the very first record it finds, that will help with the performance tremendously. So a good example is if I actually pick out a truth table, you have some options under advanced. If you select return only first result, it won't actually scan through the whole truth table. So if you have over 1,000 records and say you have an input, but you only need the first result that is returned. By doing this and only returning the first result, it won't scan the whole truth table. What happens initially, it will scan the whole truth table, it'll run every single rule to see if it has an output of more than one, and then it will output that data. So this is one way you could help improve that result. Typically, if you have more than 1,000 results, or I would even say anywhere from 50 to 100 results or rules within a truth table, I would almost not go the path of using an external truth table. You could almost accomplish the same exact thing by actually importing this information into a simple database structure within Decisions. You would then be using SQL, first running rules. We are a rule platform, but when you have truth tables and you have many conditions, it becomes very complex on that system or on your server. So your CPU will go up, running many rules can be problematic due to performance. So in my personal opinion, I would go with the route of actually using a simple database structure and having that data in there and be able to use a fetch entity step to actually fetch that data. There might be a little bit of difference between that truth table though, because with the external truth table, you could actually import it directly. So you might have to come up with a different structure of actually importing the data into that database. I don't know if the user that actually submitted this question is on with us today.
Hi, Derek. I'm here.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. So I see that you're having some issues with your truth table. Can you kind of tell me a little more about your use case, and then we could try to see what we could do?
Well, I think your suggestion to use the fetch entity step would be good because my data is already stored in a database structure.
Oh, is it?
Yes, I also am using it in a page to have CRUD actions, so the
Okay.
user can create, delete, and do that kind of stuff in the page with the
Mm-hmm.
data. So I think that's a good solution. Because
Yeah.
I really need to go to to have all these columns and all these rows. I can't not pass all the data.
Yeah. We've actually had some customers in the past that used the external truth tables. And the reason why they used them was to actually make it easier for them to import. They had like some like statements on the truth table that they were easily able to import, but it caused a lot of problems.
Hmm.
Because they had thousands to like up to like 10,000 to 20,000 records in a truth table.
Hmm.
Um, and the alternative of that, because if you use like a fetch entity step, it's essentially just accessing the database. And then when you put the fetch criteria on here, it will be using it as a where clause. And
Yes, and I can add as many as I need, right?
correct. And it's extremely performant. So
Okay.
even if this database grows to over 1 million records, as long as you're fetching the criteria prior, so by actually using the fetch criteria, you shouldn't really never hit any problems. I've seen some database tables with about 40 million records, and there's really no performance issue whatsoever.
Hmm.
So
Great.
if you have this ability, I would definitely recommend this. Um, while if you had to use the truth table in your specific use case, if you were able to use the return only one result first result
I would
with
also be able to use this.
yes. So if you did that, it could really help with the performance if you didn't want to do a lot of rework. But
Hmm.
if you still see a potential problem, um, I would actually kind of do the rework and do this way.
Yeah.
Also, a really nice tool to use. I'm not sure if you're aware, but under our system folder, admin and system tools, we have this profiler. In here, if you start a new profiler session and just say okay, and then you actually run a flow, you will be able to break that flow down and see what's taking the most time.
Hmm.
So with those actions, you might not see exactly what's going on, but you would be able to like break it down and be like, okay, the truth table is taking the most time.
Yeah,
So
that's
that
helpful.
yeah, it's very helpful in like trying to diagnose performance problems when you can't see it. So typically actions you can't really see exactly. You can't debug it unless you have that data that's being passed in. Um, so this is a very useful way to kind of diagnose any performance problems and how to optimize.
Very helpful. Thanks.
Yeah. Did you have any other questions?
Well, about the page that I created, that is showing a report that the data source is the same data structure that I'm using with the truth table that
Okay.
has more than 1,000 records. It takes a while. Not it doesn't take very long, but it takes a few seconds to load it.
Is
Is
that the
there?
report itself?
It's a page that shows a report.
Okay. So the is it the report itself that's taking a while to load?
Ah, okay. Let me see. I think so.
Okay.
No, the report is actually faster than the page.
What's on the page? Is there anything specific?
Just the report. And there is a CSS, the one that comes from decisions, just to make it look better.
Yeah. Um, so that's definitely a good question to kind of understand. So if I actually create a folder really quick, let me set test page. Here, I'm going to create a couple things really quick so we can take a look.
Okay.
In here, I will create a page dashboard, and then I just will do something simple. I'm going to add a report really quick. So I'll create this. So create new. Let's be count. All right, I'm just going to bring over a couple fields, and then I will actually add this, and so we could actually take a look at a couple things. So that department. Do okay. I'm going to add this page really quick. So there might be a couple of things you could try to diagnose, like what could be potentially the problem. And then I'll show you a couple tricks. So if a report, typically on the report itself, I've seen performance problems on the report. If you're seeing problems on the page, it could be that there's some type of component on there that's causing it. But if you have a very large report with many fields and many records within it, sometimes it depends on this data source. So if you're using like a flow data source, this could be very problematic. A
No,
couple,
it's a source from the database, the same
okay,
data. But it does has many columns and more than 1,000 records.
okay. So a couple ways that you could try to optimize it and see if it is actually that report that's causing it. If you go into your page and click on the report, let me find this really quick. There's a way where you could tell how many rows to return, and you could see if that actually helps with the load time of the page itself. I have to find where this is. If you edit the default report and go to, it's not report, grid view, no, result. Yeah, so if you jump into the report and you go to the properties on the right hand side, there is this tab called results. By default, it picks up like 500 rows per page.
Okay.
So something in that report, if you were to limit like how many rows show per page, so if you did like 100, for example, it would only show 100 rows and then everything would go into the next page. But this will reduce the amount of items being loaded onto that page at one given time, in which could help the overall performance of it.
Okay.
Something in addition that could be, because if you only have a report on this page, it seems that the report is the problem child in this.
It's in the book.
Yes. And sometimes it could be that you have like a calculated column in here.
Oh, I don't.
You don't?
No, but I tried reducing the number of rows. It
Mhm.
already helped.
It did? Okay. So you could kind of play around with that. And with the data source itself, is it a simple database structure within decisions?
It is.
Okay.
I tried to use the index, but I didn't see any difference. Not sure if I know how to use it.
Uh, the the index on I think there's actually a development task out there. I don't know if it was providing an index in the database. Um, because typically you have to write it in SQL on
Okay.
the database itself to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the create database index. So I don't know if it's released yet, but in our latest release, I think 7.10.2, there was an issue with this create database index. I don't think it was doing what it was supposed to be doing. So, but really kind of playing around with some of the report settings could help with the page. An alternative could be using a SQL report, but typically how you have it set up right now is probably the easiest way to keep it. It might just be trying to reduce the rows or
Yeah, it helped. It helped. It's fast.
okay. Well, perfect. Is there anything else I can help you with?
I'm just curious about how to setting the index because we have a team that knows a lot of SQL. So where should we set this up?
It depends. So if everything is living within decisions,
Mm-hmm.
like all your data structures and everything, typically you could use the SQL editor to kind of like test out the SQL. So how to do
Oh,
that?
not to just with the index that you open in data structure. Is it also there?
Could you repeat that? So you're referring to this index that we were just looking at, right?
Yeah, yeah, that you said that we were supposed to write some SQL to make it work.
Um, so typically an index is provided to you if you have like a join on the table, and unfortunately, you cannot see like what index are provided through decisions. But if you were to create like an index, like if you knew what the index was,
Oh, I would have
um,
to know that before.
yeah, you would have to know it, and then you could type it in here on the SQL editor and then run it, and it will create the index for you. Here, I'm gonna look at the releases and see if there was anything mentioned about this. Version 7. So, introduction. So we do have database indexing within our documentation.
Oh,
Uh,
perfect.
so what does indexing on the folder extension are built in? Is there a way to disable the auto creation? Can it be added? So these are just kind of some frequently asked questions. Um, I know we had something about release notes about an issue. So let me see index. It could have been resolved a while ago. I know there was something that came up. So with you indexing, um, it could have provided that index within there, and which could be resolved by now. But like I had an example where I had two tables that were joined together, and I was provided a index in which I was able to run through the query editor. But I was doing this on the database, on the MySQL Server database. So
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, Decisions doesn't kind of give you or provide you the information about indexes besides within this data structure as we saw before.
No, but don't worry. The report rows already helped. I was just
Okay.
curious.
Yeah, no worries. I wish I kind of had more answers for you on that itself. This should
No,
be fine. How you
you're
have
very helpful.
perfect.
Thank you very much, Derek.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye. So there was another question that came in. It says, how can I count something in the report? For example, if I want to know the count of open assignments and the count of acknowledged assignments. So if we are in a report, there's ways that you could like group by in which you could get the count provided. I'm not sure of what an account of acknowledged assignments means. So I don't know if that's actually a field within the database itself. But if I were to go back into this page, I have this report called accounts. In here, I have my email addresses, but say that there was a field that I am looking for, and say it's department. What you could do from here is you would group it by the department. So there's a section that you say group by. Now everything will be grouped. So in my case, I don't have a department for any of my accounts, so they're all under here. It still does not give us a count. The way you would accomplish this is under the results section, you would click the data up here. There's a results tab. There's subtotals. Here you could add a new one, and by default, it comes up with count. You would select the field of department, I believe. I might have to play around with this for a second. And then it has a display name. So this is how the count of the department will show up. So it would be count X. So if I hit OK here and refresh preview, you can now see that I have the count of department 5. I believe if I don't do that, hit OK. Let me refresh. Oh, so that's actually providing the name. So use paging. But typically you would also see the count of each department within here, or like say this was the state, you would see actually the count of the state of whatever the group by was, and then you would also see the total down here. So if I actually close and save this, and I'll close and save this, where we had that page was here. So you can see I have that total count at the very bottom. But say if I were to go and edit one of these reports or one of these accounts to add a department. So if I go and edit the account, so department B accounting. And then if I go back to that report, so now you can see I have accounting. It actually gave me the count of this group by right here. While this doesn't have anything that's grouping by, it's grouping by a blank value. So it did not provide me anything. You also have the ability to edit like how that name shows. And the way you can do that is by editing this. And you can just update the count like so. Also, there's a couple different things you can do. You can do like sum, average, median. So typically you would use these type of fields if there was a number within the actual report. So the field would be like a number field to actually, or a decimal, double, whatever the case might be, to be able to use this aggregation type. So there's that. So upon refresh, you can see that it updated the name, and then you can see the total at the very bottom. So hopefully that answers your question. Again, you would kind of, the best way of doing it would be by the grouping of the actual field that you would like to see the count of. It kind of gives it more of a clean look as well, as where you could kind of just jump through all the different assignments, states, whatever the case might be. Does anyone have any additional questions? If not, we can kind of go over a few things. So we were talking about the truth tables earlier. And then let me see if I could bring up some examples that we could do. If no one has any other questions. All right, here, let me see. Bear with me for 1 second while I get some stuff open. So something that another project I've been working on it's really big about generating PDFs. I've worked on a couple projects here at Decisions that were really big about having some type of PDF generation. And typically we've always done, for example, there was a use case where, they had a table and the user actually entered some type of information into like a data repeater. And they wanted to dynamically add rows to that table, and which would be presented into a PDF. So there was a couple of ways that we try to accomplish this. We try to use like a Word document, but alternatively, our best solution was using an HTML to PDF step to generate a document. So in this case, I'm probably going to build a couple things really quick to make this easier. But I'm going to create a data type. And for this one, I'm just going to use a simple database structure. And then we could add this, we could just call this a table with a couple fields in here, nothing too crazy. So we could do like field 1, or we'll do name, we'll do type, and then we'll also do a description. So here, the description, we'll set the text length to max, just in case if this ever exceeds the 255 characters by default. So now I have a simple database structure called table. I'm going to create a way to actually enter this information. So if I go back in here, let's say add items to table. I'm going to have a form that allows the user to be able to add a few things to, and then in which we'll create some of those items and then show this of how we would generate the HTML and then put it into a PDF. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a form. We'll just say form 1 for this use case. And then I will actually have a data repeater. So with this data repeater, this is a way that you could dynamically add items to. So there's a couple things with the data repeater. There's like an add button or remove button. So we'll just put both of these above this data repeater for the time being. I also need to add a button to exit this form. So this will just say continue. When setting up the button, make sure there's no questions coming in. Oh, apologize, bear with me for 2 seconds. All right, so when you actually have a data repeater, so the first thing you have to do is pick the source. So the source is a flow structure or a simple database structure like what we just created. I'm sorry, the first thing you actually have to do is create the data repeaters row inside. So here you can see that it brings up, when I pick the source, it asks me to pick an existing one or create a new repeater control. So in here, I'll just create, and then this is what the individual row would look like. So we had 3 different type of fields, which one was a name. And here we would just type, we'll keep this empty for a second. So actually, once you're in the row or the data repeater control, this is where you actually select the input type. So here you have the ability to select a simple database structure, a flow structure, whatever the case might be. For this use case, we're going to be using that table that I just created, which was a simple database structure. So now after I have my form input type, I could now select the data name for this field. So you have to have that actual input to be able to get this information. If not, you'll have an error on this actual data repeater. You won't be able to open the form until this is resolved. So here it actually brings in all the types. So the first one I'll use is the name. The second one will do the type, in which I'll just pick from data. And then there's that. And then the last one would be a multi-line text box, in which will be the description. So you could play around with the style a little bit, where you could like update the column size, the rows. So if you wanted to have like a small row and then extend the rest of it, you could do something by just adding a fixed height, then with another field that would just grow depending on how big your repeater line is. So here we'll actually stretch out the description a little bit. And then we'll just add some watermarks to make it easy to read. All right, and then we'll do all right, so now I have a data repeater created. I'm going to close and save this. And then I need an input type. So this will just be table input. I added these two add and remove buttons. So you actually have to set that on the data repeater component. So we'll select the add button and then the remove button. So now my form is complete and is ready to be used. So I will close and save this. Upon continuing, what I'm going to do is for each item that's passed out of this form, which would be the actual table input, it's the data name that I gave it. So on the input of it, we'll just ignore these fields, as we're just going to be enter this information when it's opened. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a couple records. So under my database structures, I have this table in which I will create. And then I'll just map this back to the for each step, make that a little bit cleaner. All right, so for each of those items, I will select this table list. It'll automatically update the item, and then here I will just pass that item directly in. So it'll create all this records for me. Actually, the best way to handle this would be to build data. Since I don't have that ID field yet, it needs to be created. I will just pass in all the rest of the details besides that ID from the item. So just description, name, and type. I'll close and save that. So when I click back, did not save. So description, name, type. You gotta hit the OK button. And then from here, I'll fetch this data. So typically most people's use cases, they would create the data in some other flow, and then later on they would reference it, and then they would create the HTML in which they'll pass into an HTML to PDF step. So we could actually just create everything within this single flow. So for fetching the data, I'll select the table name, and I'm just going to fetch all the records. I'll put that down here. No results, just go to the end step. I should have results upon this done path. And then what I will do is put another for each step. So for each of the results, I will then create a row. and then the done path would go here. So the first thing you typically need to do is you need to put a way to create the table's HTML prior to going through this loop to add the row. So in this case, we will use a create data step, and then we'll just add some data to add within here. So I'm just going to call it HTML. For this purpose, I will actually do merge plain text and write out the HTML. There's a couple other options you have. You could do merge HTML text, which will give you some options at the bottom. So if you actually wanted to create a table, you could do it this way. There was a link here at the bottom that says table, and then it asks you how many rows, columns, your width, but this is pretty static, so it's not really able to be dynamic, and it might not be the cleanest look as well. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do merge plain text, and then in here I'm going to write up some HTML. So I will be creating a table, and then I will have my T header. So this is what the static heading is going to look like. So we had a couple fields. We said name, and then we also had type, and then we had description. So the first thing I actually got to do is add a row, which is that tag tr, and then I will close that row after this. So the best way to handle this, you could pretty much start off with the static text. You'll always have this header within here. So unless it needs to be dynamic, you actually do have some options to input this information. So if you needed to input the header's name from something within the flow, you have the ability to do that right here. But for this use case, it's going to be static. So we created our table. We have our header section right here. And then the first row is going to contain, or there's going to be 3 columns, name, type, and description. We will create the opening tag to the T body, and then I could actually remove this. So we could add some style in here as well to make this a little bit cleaner, so we can come back to this. All right, so this is pretty static. Like I said, we'll come back and add some style and then kind of go from there. So if I hit save on that, now in this for each loop, what I'll do is I'll pass in the results from this fetch step. So under any results, you can see I have that table list, and then we will just say done. We could update this output to table item. And then what we're going to do from here is actually build those rows. The best way to do this, in my opinion, we have a step called end velocity. And it's this custom merge end velocity step. So the step is really cool. It uses like a custom language that you could input parameters to. It's a lot of stuff you could do with the end velocity step. It's pretty big in the JavaScript language. So I believe you could write like CSS, HTML in here, JavaScript. There's a couple other things you could use it for. But in our case, what we're gonna have to do is we need to pass in this HTML that we created as the first line. The second line will be creating the actual row that's being passed out of this loop. And then it will build the rows and kind of just keep going through. And then at the very end, we'll close it and then pass it in here. So for here, if you use the $sign and type in a label, you can see that it pops up as an input. In our case, we need to create, we're going to be passing in the HTML that we created in this create data step, and then we'll create a new row. And then we'll have a couple inputs. So we had 3 headers, and now we need to have 3 table row or 3 columns here as well. So in there, you'll see I'm creating my table row. I'll expand this just a little bit. Passing the HTML, creating a table row, column 1, column 2, column 3. So in here, I'll actually name this name, and then I'll name this one type, and then this will be description. So once it hits this step, I just need to map all this input. So I'll do that really quick. So this is the HTML I created earlier. And then description is going to be coming from the loop. So I called that table item. And then the first one I have is description. The same thing, table item. And then this will be the name. And then this will be the type. All right, so now I have all my inputs. I have my merge step all configured with the HTML I'm going to be using. And then the last thing, output, I need to overwrite this HTML right here. So when it gets passed back in, it has this first row. And then it'll add the second, and then it'll add the third. So to do that, you would do change value. And then we're going to be overwriting the HTML. So every time it's going to pass it back in with this first step we used. So from there, you'll just pass it back to the loop. So now it's going to be looping through the HTML, adding the rows. And then the very last thing we need to do is close that table and end the HTML. So here, what we'll do is pass in the HTML. And then I will actually close that T body and then close the table. And then we could also close the HTML, which I have to open up this to do again. So here, we'll just pass that in, which was the HTML. Same thing, we'll change the value. And then let me make a couple edits here. And I'm actually going to pull some CSS from something else I've done previously. So just give me 1 second while I do that. So under the style, we could say table. And then we could also update like the T headers background. So here we'll say background color equals black. Color equals white. So this is just saying for the T headers that we created right here, the background is going to be black while the color of the text is going to be white. We said the width of the table is going to be 100%, and then font size 12 px with the border collapse. So I'll hit save on that. So now we have everything pretty much built out to pass in the HTML to this PDF step. So from here, we just grab that HTML, pass it in, gives us a couple information. Do we want to include page numbers? We'll say no. So you can make that constant. It's going to ask for the alignment. We just said that we're not going to include them, so we could ignore. And then the file name has to be a name that includes .pdf. So we'll do test.pdf. All right, so there's that. Next thing we need to do is a way to view it. So I'll actually create another form really quick that just has a way that we could actually view this PDF that we're creating. So in here, I'll just pick or create new. I'll create a form, and this will just be view PDF. All right, the best way to accomplish this would be using a document viewer. So a document viewer, you're able to pass in any type of file data, file reference, or a document. So you can see what the input types are here. You have three options. Our case, we're creating a PDF, so it's going to pass out a file data, and then you just name it. So we'll just say PDF. For here, we'll just add a button as well, just to close this if we ever need to, which we'll just name close. All right, I'm going to close and save that. And then before we run this, I got to pass in that PDF. So you can see that it passes out from that step right before. It's a couple things too. If you had HTML from a file, you could use this, in which you could pass in that HTML file. But we're actually generating the HTML within the flow, so we'll pass it in. You could use custom page numbers. So there's certain circumstances that you want to use something more specific than just one out of X pages. But the set page dimensions I find to be very helpful. This actually will set the margin on the PDF, so you could tell how big you want the PDF in the singles and inches. So page height, typically a PDF is like 11, while the width is typically 8.5 inches. So the margins too, you could add margins on the bottom left, right. So this is like the space in between the edge of the form. So for the bottom, and this is in inches too. So typically you could do like 0.25 inches, and then kind of keep this static across for the left, right, up and down. 0.25, so I'm just going to type this stuff in. And there's also a footer height. You could give it a footer if ever needed, but typically by adding the margin bottom, you can make this a little higher. So I typically always just ignore this. All right, so now I will save this, and I think we're ready to test this out, see how it goes. So I'll be creating the table first, or the records in the table. I'll fetch them, I'll create the HTML, I'll loop through each record and create a row, and then I'll pass it into a PDF step in which we can view. So from here, start debugging. By default, I didn't pass anything in, so I have to click this add data. So you can see I have to type a name type. So we'll say name is test1, type is tester, description, this is a test. So you can see we could add many rows in here. Just pretty much copy this information. So for test 5. All right, so I'll hit continue. It's going to create the data, and then we should be able to view it in that form. All right, so you can see, though it's not the cleanest, but what it did was we created our header, which is in bold. It looks like the CSS was ignored, so I can take a look at that. But for each row, we had 5 rows that we created in total, so you can see it dynamically passed those rows into here, in which we were able to view. So there's a lot of cool stuff you could do with indecisions. You can make very complex PDFs that are very dynamic to like include or not include information that is all handled within the flow, and to be able to dynamically view it in a form, or save it to decisions and use it in another use case. It's starting to become a lot more popular within decisions to dynamically or to generate PDFs in general, especially if like what the form you're filling out looks like. So when it comes to dynamic building rows, this is very useful. There's a lot of cool stuff you could do within here too. I don't know if anyone has any questions about that, but I'm going to come back and look at the style and see what happened. So table. So just looking at it, it looks like it's all correct. Looks like it might be missing something though. So we did tester table. Something you could always use is use like an editor to play around with the stuff as well. So if even I come over here, you can see this is how it looks on this text editor. So it could be that I have that table. Yep, that's the reason why I had that period. So now you can see that I've edited just a little bit. I had that period in which was causing that issue. So you can always clean up the HTML a little bit, make it a little more readable. And then you could add like a border to it. PX. We'll do a solid red border. And then you could also add the border here as well for the bottom of this actual header. So if you add like another border bottom, you do 1px solid red. So now you can see I have that bottom border, and then you could also add a border around each row by doing td and then just say border 1px solid red. Let me clean this up just a little bit. All right, so now you can see this is what it looks like in my editor. So all I did was update the style right here. So if I copy this and then I actually go back into here and I update my style. So I had a couple wrong of my tags. I had those periods in there, which caused the issue. It's now coming back. It looks like it's good to go. I could hit save. And then if I just wanted to skip this part, since I've already created some data, I could just do this. In which if I debug again, now you can see that it has that table in there, exactly how we were just looking at it. So you could also add a lot of different information. The only thing, this is really for tables, making them dynamic, or if you had information that's dynamic, a good way of doing that is by creating a little bit of the HTML first, looping through the results, and then adding the information if there, and then closing it and then adding it. So there's a lot you could do within decisions, and this is definitely something that a lot of our customers do currently. So even if I wanted to add some information, I could add like a header in here. H2. So I'm going to copy some text and just pass it in here just so we have something. So now I can hit save on that. I'll save this and then I'll run it again. So now you can see that it's like adding some additional information that we could input, and then the table could represent it. So a lot of tweaking, a lot of back and forth to make it right. A lot of times I like playing around with this in some type of SDK environment in which I could play around with HTML and see how it looks like before I actually implement in decisions. It's probably one of the best practices, like build out exactly what the PDF should look like, visualize it, and then figure out like what's going to be dynamic. So once you have all the HTML written out, you know, if there's dynamic parts of it, then you can create some like rule logic or flow logic that will output only like this section of the HTML. So if it's not there, it's not included, it'll make the PDF more dynamic instead of always having static data that's not there. So I just added this tag. It's creating a div in which I will break a line. So there will be a little bit of space in between that PDF. While we were looking at it previously, the table is right up on that paragraph. So now running it again, you can see now I have a little bit of separation in there. And then you can see I added some margin in the beginning on the left and right hand side. So if you think that's like too much, the easiest way of doing it was on the step itself. So we did on the left and right 0.25. So if I switch this to a 1 instead, and then I debug this again, it still looks like it's still a little bit of a margin. So yeah, you could play around with it. We could set this to actually 0. It might have something to do with the page width right here as well. So we're going to set it to 0 and see if that helped us out at all. Looks like it did not. So coming back to it, if you were to actually just ignore the page height and page width. So we don't have any page width, so it will dynamically set it. And then I try this again, we'll probably see that margin. Nope, maybe not. Well, that was a quick little tortilla, a little overview of how to create some type of PDF generation within Decisions, even though it's very basic. Kind of gives you a good understanding of how to dynamically create rows to a table and how you could input some of this information. So there's always a little bit of tweaking when doing this type of stuff, and will take a little bit to get to a final version, but it's a quick overview. I don't know if anyone has any questions about that, or if we could call it a day for the lunch and learn. I think it's just us. You guys want to end it?
I think we're safe to end the call for now.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Derek. That was awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, kind of went a little tangent.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. That was great.
Perfect. All right, guys. Well, I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, Derek. You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.